Howdy ho, this is Dylan with Semi-Analysis, and I'm here to bring you some interesting and new information on Nvidia's Ada Lovelace, including some of the leaked specifications, some die sizes, architecture, and cost analysis. Nvidia was the victim of a cyber attack at the end of February where they were hacked for a vast sum of data. This hack was not only a disaster for Nvidia, but all chip companies and the national security of all Western countries. Among the hacked data was detailed specifications and simulation data for Nvidia's next generation GPUs, Hopper and Ada. Hopper is now sampling and was unveiled by Nvidia at GTC. The specs of Hopper match exactly to this leak. But Ada, which is named after the famous computer scientist and mathematician Ada Lovelace, is still many months away from launch. As such, these specifications are very interesting. Based on these leaked specifications and simulations, Semi-Analysis and Locuza have teamed up to analyze the architecture, die sizes, and do a cost analysis even, as well as product positioning. We did not download any of the leaked files from the Lovelace hack. However, many people online shared excerpts, which is what these are based upon. We were able to determine that these were the specs based upon these leaked specs, and they are quite interesting. Here is a table comparing Ampere and Ada Lovelace, the specifications of both. The rest of this video will go through and talk about the block diagrams of each chip, the architecture, and an estimated die size. We're also going to explain how we arrived at this die size. Given both Locuza and Semi-Analysis are directly supported by our subscribers, we would greatly appreciate it if you could watch the rest of this video, subscribe to my free or paid newsletter, and subscribe to Locuza on Patreon. So, starting off, the top dog in the Ada Lovelace architecture is the Ad102 Die, and we have estimated it to be 611.3 millimeters squared. It's a huge jump over the previous generation GA102 in terms of performance, right? We've got 70% more CUDA cores coming from 5 additional GPCs. The memory bus width remains at 384-bit bus, though. So we can expect memory speeds to improve slightly to somewhere in the region of 21 gigabytes per second, maybe a little bit higher, but mostly around there. So this increase in memory bandwidth is not enough to feed the beast that is Ada Lovelace 102. As such, Nvidia seems to have added 96 megabytes of L2 cache, which is way larger than Ampere's GA102's 6 megabytes of L2 cache. Now, we can use this and look at an AMD's Navi 22 GPU, right? And AMD's Navi RDNA 2 GPU architecture has a feature called Infinity Cache, which is a large L3 cache. We hope Nvidia names their large L2 Infinity Cache just as a troll, but yeah, that's probably not going to happen. The marketing folks probably have a better idea. But, based on this, we can see that, there's a difference in cache hierarchy between the two vendors. But we expect the general trend of hit rates to be largely the same. As such, AMD has hit rates of 78% at 1080p, 69% at 1440p, and 53% in 4K. So these hit rates are basically when you don't need to go to memory to in the process of rendering something. And so they reduce the memory bandwidth requirements. NVIDIA's L2 should work largely in the same manner and will help feed AD102 despite the small increase in memory bandwidth. The top-end configuration of AD102 should probably be 24 gigabytes of GDDR6X for the gaming market, but we expect it to be cut down from this further. The next GPU in the lineup would be AD103. AD103 is quite interesting as a configuration, and we've estimated it at 379.69 millimeters squared. Versus AD102, it is a huge downgrade. This may be the largest gap between the top die and the second die in a GPU generation, with AD102 having more than 70% CUDA cores versus AD103. The other interesting thing is that the CUDA cores are the exact same as the current generation GA102. Despite this, the memory bus comes in at 256-bit. So this is the exact same as GA104 in the current generation Ampere. So with a much smaller memory bus than AD102 at 384, this means that gaming GPUs based on AD103 would max out probably at 16 gigabytes, but cut down variants will likely exist. Despite memory bandwidth being much lower than GA102, the inclusion of 64 megabytes of L2 cache should probably allow this GPU to be fed. Given Nvidia is utilizing a custom TSMC 4N node, which is a variant of TSMC's N4, or N4P, we expect that they will be able to clock much higher than GA102. The increase in clocks, combined with some of the architectural enhancements that we expect, which we'll get to later in this video, will allow AD103 to perform better than the current generation flagship RTX 3090 Ti. If they bring it, that is, if they bring it to the desktop with a high amount of power consumption. It's important to note that GA103 never came to desktop and is really only available in the top end of laptop GPUs. So this could happen again with the Ada generation. AD104 is estimated at 300.45 millimeters squared. This is the sweet spot for Ada. This is due to its performance and cost effectiveness. The GPU is quite small, which is nice, and it also only has a 192 bit bus, which would lead to it having 12 gigabytes of memory for the gaming GPU market, which is, high enough capacity for, current use cases and developing games, but or newer games, but it also keeps the bill of materials, the BOM, down to a reasonable level, right? If you go to 16 gigabytes, that would just be too costly. Simultaneously, Nvidia GPUs tend to have their 104 designs have similar performance to the prior 102. If this trend keeps up, the cost to performance would be excellent. In fact, it may even have more performance than the current generation GA102, given Nvidia is likely to pump clocks quite a bit to hit performance above the 3090. We expect Nvidia to go as high as 350 watt or maybe even 400 watt for AD104 desktop GPU with GDDR6X. As such, we expect this GPU to be the one that most enthusiasts end up purchasing because it's still within a reasonable price range. The GPU will also be highly efficient, right? With G6X, that there is some inefficiencies, but when we move down to the laptop world, it can be very efficient if you clock it to the right levels and keep it with regular G6 memory at 14 or 16 gigabit a second in the total power consumption around the 90 to 135 watt arena. AD106 is the true mass market GPU of this generation. It's estimated at a tiny 203.21 millimeters squared. It's likely going to be the highest volume GPU in the lineup, as the 106 GPUs are always the highest end, at least they were for Pascal, Turing, and Ampere. Due to the tiny 128-bit bus, the memory will most likely max out at 8 gigabytes. In the top configuration, we expect it to perform very similarly to GA104's 3070. It might even beat the 3070 and get up to 3070 Ti levels. That assumption might be optimistic given there's only 3 GPCs in AD106 versus the 6 in GA104, but Nvidia might be able to solve this, with higher clocks and with their large 32 megabytes of L2 cache. With those hot 32 megabytes of L2 cache, the GPU cache rates are going to be 55%. Hit rates for their cache is going to be 55% in 1080p, 38% in 1440p, and 27% in 4K. So this would match. This is based on AMD's Navi 23, which also has a similarly sized 32 megabytes of L2 cache. So before we move on to the baby of the generation, AD107, we want to give a bit of background. The data posted on Twitter from the leak files does not specify a cache size for this GPU. The prior GPUs in this lineup had a 16 megabyte, L2 cache per 64 bits of memory controller or frame buffer partition. With that, that would mean AD107 wouldn't make much sense because the GPC count and the bus width are identical, and the TPCs per GPU only fell by 4. So if the L2 cache stays the same, with that same 16 megabytes per 64 bits of memory controller or FBP, then the die size would only fall to 203 millimeters squared. From 203 to 184.28 millimeters squared. This is a tiny decrease and would not be enough to separate the two GPUs in the stack. Instead, we can look back at Turing, and Turing actually had an interesting phenomenon where TU-106 and TU-116 had a similar relationship, right? Where Nvidia pulled a couple different things out of this, right? They made the bus width slightly smaller, yes, and they pulled ray tracing and tensor cores out. But one of the things that people often overlook is that they also reduced the amount of cache per FBP. They went with 0.5 megabytes or 512 kilobytes of L2 cache instead of 1 megabyte, as the rest of the Turing, the higher end Turing lineup did. And so if we apply that same pattern of half the L2 cache per FBP, then AD107 ends up being around 145.54 millimeters squared. So that's a much more reasonable die size, and it would make sense given, product positioning and cost and, having to hit every point in the market for this. So moving on to AD107, they're also going to cut down the PCIe lanes to 8x, and, cut down the cache and cut down the course count slightly. As such, they always cut down this 107 die to 8 lanes because more are unneeded. There's no need to have 16x, and plus this bottom GPU is generally in the mobile world anyways, where 8x makes more sense from a power perspective as well. So this GPU would still blow the socks off of Intel's Meteor Lake integrated graphics, or even AMD's RDNA 2 based Rembrandt, or even their Phoenix, next generation Phoenix APU. So this would still be cheap, at such a small die size of 145.54 millimeters squared, but it would also be, faster than any integrated graphics. So it would make sense in some of these, lower cost laptops that still want, where the buyers still want a game. Overall, Ada is quite an interesting lineup. At the top end, there's quite the increase in performance and probably power consumption, and AD102 is a similar die size to GA102. But this is on a much more expensive, customized TSMC 4N process node rather than the very cheap, customized Samsung 8N process node. The density increase from a TSMC N4 derivative is quite large relative to Samsung's 8 nanometer derivatives, which would justify the cost increase per wafer. But likewise, despite being a much newer node, TSMC N4 actually has better parametric yield than Samsung's 8 nanometer. Despite similar catastrophic yields. So catastrophic yields are when a feature within the silicon die does not function. Parametric yield is, yes, it functions, but it functions at the level we want it to. The issue with Samsung's nodes is often not defects, but catastrophic yields, but parametric yields, in that they do not, they can get the transistors to work, but oh crap, this transistor's really bad, and or this area of the die is very bad, and it causes the entire chip to have much lower clocks. So this parametric yield being higher is very important, as GPUs are a very yield harvestable design and very large dies. So they can keep more parts of the die enabled, which is something that we've seen on GA104, where a lot of the die was disabled in the case of something like a 3080 and a 3060 Ti even. So the rest of Ada comes away a lot tamer than AD102 in terms of die sizes and overall bill of materials cost to manufacture. Performance should generally be above that of Ampere's at the same power, which is with a decently lower cost to fabricate, despite the much higher wafer costs of TSMC's 4 process node. We played around with the wafer costs and die calculations, and we came up with some estimations, and we even included some various costs related to passives such as VRMs and other active components like the memory. And in the end, the prices are shouldn't be too bad. I think consumers will actually win with this generation. Nvidia sells the die with a markup, right? Everyone knows that. And then, they negotiate a bulk memory pricing for original device manufacturers and add-in board partners to use. So these add-in board partners still, buy the die from Nvidia, and then they buy the memory, which is already has a negotiated price from the vendors of memory, and they integrate that as alongside all the power components and cooling and etc. So the die cost has a different effect, dollar for dollar, how much more a die cost versus how much more memory or VRMs cost. And so Nvidia seems to have balanced their L2 caches with the memory bus width optimally, right? You don't want to go too wide on the memory bus or too narrow, because then that's going to influence your memory capacities on these GPUs. Memory sizes seem to stay very reasonable, and most GPUs will probably have 16 gigabit dies of G6X or G6. In general, AD104 is going to be replacing GA102 in terms of performance, actually beating it some while also costing less, while AD106 is going to replace, the current GA104 based dies in the performance tier, right? So 3070s, think of that level. And so when you think about it from that perspective, the memory cost is identical, right? Because AD104 should have similar memory sizes to GA102, and AD106 will have similar memory sizes to GA104, AD106 to GA104. They will move from 8 gigabit to 16 gigabit, but the cost to fab the die is actually going to be less, despite the more expensive node, because of a much larger, much smaller die. Board components such as packaging, cooling, power components are actually going to end up being cheaper, generally due to the better efficiency, lower power consumption, and smaller boards that these GPUs will require. So when we compare dies in the stack, GA104 versus AD104, there is going to be a memory size increase, and there's going to be a slight price increase in base MSRP. But the issue with that is GA104 is only 8 gigabytes. Right, or you can go with 16 gigabit dies or double-sided and get 16 gigabytes of memory, but then you end up with it being too expensive. So GA104 is really not in a sweet spot nowadays for memory because of this issue with the bus width. Whereas AD104 moves up to 12 gigabytes due to their 192-bit bus. Fears of higher power consumption should definitely be taken into consideration. Nvidia is likely pumping power for each die, similar to what they did the prior generation. In fact, we imagine that they're going to push power to what one die higher in the stack did. So by that we mean AD104 will likely reach 3080 levels of power consumption, and AD106 likely reaches 3070 levels of power consumption. And rumors point to the top AD102 breaking records for power consumption. So next we'll talk about how we arrived at these die size estimates. The first step in the die size analysis was to gather architectural changes regarding Ada and comparing them to Ampere. So the SM architecture is 8.9 versus 8.6 on Ampere. So this is an improvement, but it's a generational improvement. It's not, a whole new SM architecture. As a result, we can assume that the SM die size increased, area for an SM increased about 10%. And while we aren't sure what these SM architectural changes are, they likely could be, something like a 192-bit kilobit L1 cache or new tensor cores. The highest probability change in our minds is actually the addition of a new third-generation ray tracing core. Other architectural changes are on the I/O front, right? So the leak indicates that NVLink has been removed entirely from the lineup, which indicates NVIDIA is not going to push the Ada lineup for multi-GPU sort of data center and professional visualization applications, right? There's, the RTX A6000, which can do multiple GPUs and be used for these professional visualization and even data center applications. But that's not going to be possible with Ada, where the 102 die looks like it doesn't have any NVLink. We expect PCI 5.0, and a better memory controller for the slightly higher speed GDDR6X. and also DisplayPort 2.0. All these changes to be included. There's also the high likelihood that NVENC and NVDEC, the encoding engine and decoding engine are upgraded to include, AV1 and some more feature levels around that. The biggest change with Ada is, of course, the L2 cache, at least on an area perspective. Instead of the small L2 cache, NVIDIA's taken a picture out of AMD's Infinity Cache book and used a much larger cache across the board. Given we have most of the specifications, architectural changes, and configurations for the lineup, we can actually use Ampere's GA102 IP blocks to recreate a hypothetical GPU with the same specifications as AD102 on Samsung's 8nm. So this would be using, the exact same cache sizes, GPC sizes, memory controller sizes, etc. as GA102. And we arrived at a die size of 1629.6 millimeters squared. That's if Lovelace AD102 had the same architecture and configuration on Samsung's 8nm. This doesn't contemplate, the changes in SM architecture, the larger encoder decoder blocks, PCIe 5.0, DisplayPort 2.0, or the tweaked memory controller and some of these other changes. The larger, but it does contemplate, using the same configuration. With this die size of 1629.6 millimeters squared, you can immediately notice that the L2 cache is titanic. Right, this is huge. This is larger than, AMD has their large L3 Infinity cache on Navi 21, but they don't allocate such a large area dedicated to the cache. And yes, while AMD is using a denser TSMC N7 node, this is only a small part of the puzzle. Actually, most of the difference in density comes from a difference in layout and configuration of that cache. So GA102 uses 48 128 kilobyte slices of SRAM with a 1 megabyte L2 cache per 64 bits of memory controller or frame buffer partition. If we look at other places in NVIDIA's lineup, GA100, that uses 80 512 kilobyte slices. So these larger slices vastly improve density, as seen with the comparison to AMD's L2 cache. The density increase of GA100 is far more than just that of the, process node shrink. And yes, while AMD is not as good as NVIDIA in many elements of design, they are undoubtedly better in areas of cache and packaging. We believe a lot of this stems from their CPU teams and the pedigree there. So AMD is very, very good at making extremely dense, high-performance caches. And they applied this to their GPUs with Infinity Cache. In fact, in our final die size estimates, NVIDIA's 96 megabytes of L2 is still not as dense as AMD's 96 megabytes of L3 Infinity Cache. So regardless of the shrink from Samsung's 8 to TSMC 4, that alone wouldn't make GA102's building blocks reach a reasonable die size. Instead, there is a architectural rework from the ground up required for the cache design. The leaks indicate there is now 16 megabytes of L2 per 64 megabytes of FBP, which is very different from GA102's 1. And so we estimate NVIDIA is going to actually use 2048 kilobyte slices, so 48 2 megabyte slices of SRAM for their L2 cache rather than 48 128 kilobytes. So a huge increase in slice size, which would greatly increase density. With this cache configuration, we can actually even calculate the theoretical cache bandwidth with these figures. So AMD has 1.99 terabytes a second of Infinity Cache bandwidth on their Navi 21 GPU when it's clocked at 1.94 gigahertz. If we assume NVIDIA is running at the same, 1.94 gigahertz on AD102, they would actually be able to achieve 5.96 terabytes a second of bandwidth with their L2. So clocks will differ in the end products, but we expect clocks for Lovelace to, Ada Lovelace to be somewhere around 2.25 gigahertz, which would be realistic in a desktop platform, right? Whereas with RDNA 2, it can clock higher than, this clock speeds that we indicated before. And in fact, RDNA 3 probably on desktop goes above 2.5 gigahertz. How much, we're not sure, but most likely it goes above that figure. Nvidia has, always made the design choice of density over clock speeds, whereas AMD's designs tend to be a little bit more relaxed in comparison. But that doesn't apply to the cache, actually. NVIDIA could have introduced a higher density, 8 or 16 megabyte per slice, but then they would have to reduce the number of slices vastly, which would reduce the bandwidth, which, isn't tenable given the way, L2 works on AMD's architecture with the delta color compression and other aspects. We came up with estimates for what this different cache architecture would do to the area of AD102, using the GA102 building blocks. And so once we accounted for the architectural changes, we also applied shrink factors to TSMC's N7 node and then another one to TSMC's N4 node. And these shrink factors are not homogeneous across the die, right? Analog shrinks differently than SRAM, which shrinks differently than logic. So the SRAM appears to be about a 60-40 split of SRAM to logic, which influences the SRAM shrink figure that we used. That's for the L2 cache. And then for the rest of the die, we applied a 10% gross up factor to the SMs to account for any architectural changes there. And we also had some different shrink factors with the various pieces of digital logic because their mix of SRAM to logic was different. The SRAM percentage on these other pieces of logic was generally around 30% and 70% logic. So this made the shrink factor higher. Lastly, we kept the analog portions of the die identical. There is a small shrink, from Samsung's 8 to 7, TSMC 7 to TSMC 4, but it's not that large. And these would probably most likely be equalized with any potential upgrade to PCIe 5.0, a slightly better, GDDR6 memory controller and PHY, and DisplayPort 2.0. So the analog portions we kept pretty much identical. Obviously, NVLink was still removed. And that's how we arrived at 611.3 millimeters squared. And actually that nicely lines up with, what Copite 7 Kimi, the famous NVIDIA leaker, has stated. He stated the die size was around 600 millimeters squared. Us getting 611.3 seems pretty good, and it helps us feel confident in our estimate. So after gathering, this small overview, we could use the configurations for the rest of the lineup, right? GPCs, TPC counts, L2 sizes, the command buffers, the various differences in PHYs, whether it's bus width or PCIe size, display controllers, the crossbar sizes. All of these can be dynamically scaled based upon the GPU configuration. And so, these shrink factor figures can be used that we determined based on some statements from TSMC plus what we've measured in real products. And in the end, it is a bit of a shot in the dark. We're not going to lie to you, but we think it's an educated guess onto the die sizes. For AD107, we will note that we backed off on the architectural shrink due to the smaller amount of cache per FBP, frame buffer partition. So, the density gains from, just larger L2 cache slices do back off slightly at AD107 in our estimate. Overall, Ada Lovelace isn't a massive departure architecturally from the current Ampere architecture, but the changes it brings, such as improved ray tracing cores, and, improved encoders for AV1, larger L2 cache, these changes bring performance up considerably, but they also keep costs down, despite being on the expensive, more expensive custom TSMC N4 node. NVIDIA is keeping with the tradition of keeping memory sizes well balanced across the stack, with a moderate increase in memory size per level. Right, they're not going to too large of memory sizes, which would influence the cost to manufacture and essentially the cost to the end consumer. Instead, they're keeping it modest, and they're balancing the size of their L2 with that memory bus width. So that's a good thing to point out. Versus AMD, rumors point to very high performance, but also, very high cost at the top end of the stack due to, this hybrid bonding that they want to introduce, allegedly. But we're much more interested in Navi 33 as a chip, which we uh, assume that it will fall somewhere in between AD104 and AD106, probably closer to AD104, but the range is large because we don't know the exact architectural changes. But leaks point to it being a very good competitor in the mass market segment. And while AMD is currently massively behind in gaming performance in current or next generation games, depending on how you want to see it, due to their lackluster ray tracing performance, and they lack many differentiated software features such as DLSS and RTX Studio, and those hurt competitiveness. But Navi 33 is going to make this the most competitive GPU generation in a decade. Nvidia is the reason they're pumping clocks is partially because they want to optimize cost and performance, and maximize their margins and performance that the end consumer gets, but also because they're, frankly, scared of what AMD is going to produce. And so, with GPU prices falling fast as Ethereum 2.0 slams on the brakes from mining demand, the slight fall in, the crypto market has caused, mining to become a little bit less profitable. And then, consumers are shifting their spending away from a mix of, goods more towards services. All of these things combined with, higher inflation across the whole broader market mean that demand has gone down and prices are coming more in line. And as such, we predict Ada Lovelace and RDNA 3 GPU prices, at least for Navi 33, to be quite good in the price to performance market of $400 to $1,000. There'll be a couple GPUs scattered through there, and the top end of the stack will be well above 1,000. Right, both Nvidia and AMD are going to increase prices on the top of the stack, but which is great for the hyper enthusiasts, but even for normal people that can't afford such an expensive GPU, I think this is going to be the best generation for consumers in a long time, right? Much better than the short-lived Ampere, or much better than Turing, much better than Ampere, right? The short-lived Ampere in the sense that prices were skyrocketed a bit after release, but in short, price to performance is going to go up. And at the top of the stack, cost will, but so will performance move up, considerably, and consumers will win. So thanks for watching, and please subscribe to the channel, to my free or paid newsletter, and to Lakuza's Patreon. Thanks. Bye.